एंड आपने बताया कि अगर एक इनवर्स यील्ड कर्व रहा तो दैट माइट कॉज अ रिसेशन. तो इसका क्या रीजन है कि इनवर्स यील्ड कर्व है तो
So
रिसेशन आ
inverse
सकता है?
yield curve, just to repeat, जब short term आपका मान लो 7% दिखा रहा है और 10Y आपका 5.5% दिखा रहा है, for
Right.
example. तो if you go further out, you go into time, yield गिर रहा है. Generally उल्टा होता है. Generally it's an upward slope. But just in case it is down, it could possibly mean a recession. Why? Because it shows that अभी तो इकोनॉमी ठीक चल रही है, बट 6 महीने बाद, 1 साल बाद जब रिसेशन आएगा या 2-3 क्वार्टर्स बाद जब रिसेशन आएगा, तब सेंट्रल बैंक जोर से इंटरेस्ट रेट काटेगी, क्योंकि रिसेशन आया है. तो इकोनॉमी को स्टिमुलेट करने के लिए, इन द केस ऑफ आरबीआई, इन द केस ऑफ द यूएस द फेड, in the case of Europe, ECB, in the case of China, PBOC, whatever it is, they will cut rates after some time, and therefore future rates are lower. But उसमें भी बहुत catch ये है, the reason inverted yield curve did not successfully signal a recession in the US over the last 2-3 years was the yield curve was in nominal terms. तो वो yield curve आपका ऊपर था क्योंकि short term inflation was high. Long-term inflation, people were expecting to normalize. This may now change with tariffs. We'll come to it in a bit. So, inflation-adjusted yield curve, what is known as real yield curve, was actually not inverted or not that inverted. But historically, because inflation was not so different over the short term and long term in the US, it was okay as a shorthand to say if it is inverted, it's probably leading to a recession. But what people really meant was real interest rates. Because if to stimulate an economy, real interest rates have to come down, right? अगर मैंने inflation आ गई 1% down आ गई और interest rate भी 1% ही काटा, तो real stimulation तो हुआ नहीं economy का, right? Real stimulation happens if inflation comes down by 1%, I cut the interest by 2%. Then in real terms, I've brought down the interest rate by 1%, 1 minus 2. So the reason the inverted yield curve in this particular case, last 2.5 years, did not successfully signal a recession in the US as generally it would have, was because after 2022, the short-term inflation spike happened in America, which led to a short-term increase in interest rates. People assumed, the markets assumed, inflation going forward will normalize. So it was not an inverted yield curve in real terms. So that was the extra second layer analysis that was required.
Got it.
But generally, it does signal a recession successfully, generally.
And बाकी countries के case में inverted yield curve has always like signaled a recession.
See, not always. It's always a very high percentage. But again, it's nothing is 100%. But it generally does, because why else would the yield curve be inverted, right? What it is showing is that if you have an OIS curve, it's an overnight index swap curve. It's just a fancy way of saying कि if I could have 365 days, 365 on the x-axis, every day का overnight interest curve, and then have for another 4-5 years, based on the futures markets, मैं guess कर रहा हूँ market का अभी क्या guess है, हर every single day for the next 5 years short term rate क्या होगा. If you add it all up, it's a overnight index swap rate curve, right? OIS curve. Why would the markets expect that rate, the short term rate, to suddenly fall after 4 months or 6 months? Because they would expect it generally because it is a slowdown. In emerging economies, or in the case of US in 2022, a genuine reason was inflation अचानक से कम हो जाएगा. In developed economies, inflation generally remains broadly stable. So in that case, अगर inflation broadly stable है and then the interest rate is coming down, it automatically means real interest rate is coming down. The real interest rate will only come down because the market feels like economic slowdown होने वाला है जोर से. Therefore, the central bank will come in and cut rates to re-stimulate the economy. And therefore, the market is deducing that if the real inversion is there in the yield curve, it is probably a sign of the markets expecting a serious slowdown or potentially a recession.
Got it. Very, very beautifully explained. I think काफी easily आपने explain किया on the interest rate bond yield curve. So जैसे जब interest rates कम होते हैं, I also studied when I was studying economics कि interest rates अगर कम हो गए, so it will be less attractive for foreign institutional investors to park money because they'll get lesser returns. So what is the exact correlation between the interest rates and the FII investment being there?
Another excellent question, Kushal. First answer, there's no exact correlation.
Okay.
Again, by now you're seeing a pattern that there are only patterns. There is no exact correlation. India, as an emerging economy, by the way, India entered global emerging market debt indices only recently, in the last 1 year or so. So we entered JP Morgan, I think in 2024 June end, emerging market, not even the global bond indices. What it means to enter a emerging market bond index is, let's say you're a debt hedge fund manager sitting out of London or New York, and you get institutional money. You have a benchmark for your clients that I want to beat this benchmark. That benchmark now has India in it.
Oh, wow.
Which was not the case earlier. And of course, it involves a certain back office processes, certain logistical process that allows them to easily invest in and sell in India bonds, in this case, government bonds.
I think India was also part of MSCI index, the Morgan
So,
Stanley
see, we've
index.
always been part of MSCI for a long 25 years on the equity side. So, we opened up the equities to FIIs, or what is known as FPIs, a generation before we opened up the debt side.
Okay.
Uska bhi pros and cons hai. Technically, you want people to buy your debt, not your equity, right? Because hopefully your equity will give higher returns. But the problem with debt is you have to give it back. Equity, you don't have to. So from a risk perspective, opening up equity was less risky. From a return perspective, opening up equity first was less optimal. But we played it safe. We first opened up equity markets. Now we are opening up the bond markets, at least on the inflow side. Outflow will be the last step. So we opened up. So what has happened now, this process applies to India, whereby if we lower interest rates too much, the debt flows, other things being equal, should stop coming in to that extent. Halaki, and I'm sorry to say, there is always an exception. Usme bhi exception hai. Because if interest rates fall a lot, your long-term bonds actually become more attractive. Because when interest rates go down, your long-term bonds, the high duration bonds, see capital gains.
क्यों ऐसे क्यों होता है?
Because वही सेम थिंग राइट, आपका 10 ईयर का बॉन्ड है, पहले 6% में ट्रेड कर रहा था, जब रिस्क फ्री आपका 6% था, तो इट वाज द फेस वैल्यू वाज 100, द मार्केट वैल्यू वाज 100. नाउ लेट अस से योर शॉर्ट टर्म बिकम्स 3%. सो बोलते हैं ना, जैसे आपने सीएफए में मॉडिफाइड ड्यूरेशन एक्सेट्रा एक्सेट्रा, दैट 100 will become say 150 or 160 because the cost of money became less. So anything that is now is giving 6% as a coupon becomes more attractive now than it was last year. वो 6% कूपन तो चेंज नहीं हुआ. So anything which has a steady cash flow stream becomes more attractive when the short-term risk-free rate falls.
Okay.
So actually what happens is, when interest rates fall, if somebody wants to buy a long-term government bond, it may become more attractive because उसका momentum trade बन सकता है. But that aside, it's a general rule, when interest rates fall, foreign investors don't want to buy your debt because अगर उनको यूएस में 4% मिल रहा था और यूएस का रेट नहीं चेंज हुआ और आपके यहाँ 6% मिल रहा था, and now you are giving 5%, gap is much less. Would they want to take the currency risk, etc.? And we'll come to currency in a bit later. But other things being equal, then they don't want to buy it. But then again, your equities can become more attractive because you cut the rates. As I discussed, equities become more attractive. And historically, actually, foreign investments in India have come on the equity side. Okay. So then it's a question of empirical trade-off. ये भारी पड़ रहा है, ये भारी पड़ रहा है. There is no right answer, which is why you were saying exact correlation. I began by saying there is no exact correlation. Yeah. It depends. Will the debt slowdown be more in magnitude versus the equity inflows?
Got it.
So it's very interesting that, and there are of course other factors also. Let's not overly complicate it for the audience, but that's broadly the headline, that debt will become less attractive for foreigners. Equities may become more attractive.
If you learned something new from this video, do share it with your friends and subscribe to this channel so that we can bring you the best content possible. Also, if you want to watch this entire episode, click on the link in the description box and you can go to Kushal Lodha YouTube channel and watch the entire podcast episode. Thank you so much for watching this and have an amazing day.